All right, we're back.
We are back. We are back. We're on?
Yes, we're on.
Sure. Good. Um, so, yeah, sorry. So, mapping apologetics, we are actually covering the our classical apologetics section.
All
Um,
three.
all three. All three.
Yeah.
So, Richard Swinburne, William Lane Craig, and Norman Geisler.
hmm
So we will do our best to work through these three. I might need to switch to this. There are workers. Let's see. Hopefully this won't throw off our game.
We'll see.
You there?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Oh, that's right. That's right. That's right. I turned. So why don't you start with Swinburne while I sort of set this up?
Sure. So I guess Richard's. I guess so. To kind of do an overview of the classical apologetic approach is to prove theism and then to prove Christianity from that foundation of having proved theism, right? And Richard Swinburne
Right. Right.
uses Bayes' theorem and inductive logic and reasoning to get basically to prove that it's highly probable that theism is true, and then that it's highly probable that Christianity is true. And that's kind of the overarching
Right. So this
approach.
is this is classic sort of. This is a classic
Yeah,
two-step approach for all of these thinkers, right?
yeah, they all have
Proof
the
theism,
same.
then proof Christianity.
Exactly, they have the same two-step approach, but they all do
Yeah.
it slightly differently. So Swinburne uses inductive reasoning, whereas I think one of the
Correct.
others does deductive. And to remind the difference, induction is all probability based. It's not all logical axioms, whereas
Mhm.
deductive is completely logical and certain.
Right.
Um, and that's kind of the difference there.
Right.
Um,
Inductive reasoning is very similar to like scientific reasoning.
yeah. So yeah, I mean, this his chapter kind of outline. I feel like outlines the process in an order that's pretty defined. The other chapters are a
Hmm.
little more that they bounce around a bit in what they talk about.
Yeah.
But in
Yeah.
Swinburne, it's like okay, talks about self-consistent theism is self-consistent, so that's the theism is coherent, and then it goes to the existence of God, and then there's some details in there, and then it goes to Christianity, and it's a pretty linear approach in the
Yeah.
chapter. Um,
By the
so
way, I thought that theism, if I can add to your point,
mhm.
or just to expand on theism, as our author of the book defines it on page 192, holds that God is a spirit who is an omnipresent creator and sustainer of the universe, a free being, omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good, a source of moral
Mhm.
obligation, immutable, eternal, existing necessarily. Which, by the way, I thought that was really packed for like basic theism.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, do you know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know. I guess like all theistic religions and notions of God would fit in with this definition, um,
Well, it's
except
a
for deism, right?
yeah. Mhm.
Deism wouldn't, because deism is I would say you'd have everything there, but really not worthy of worship,
Mhm.
because the God's basically like a builder, like a world builder. It's built the world, but it's not involved and not interacting with it. It doesn't care much about it.
Mhm.
Um, but but as I'm looking at first, I thought the definition was way too broad. But the more that I look at it, it seems like all of the available gods on the God menu would would fit in with this definition,
Mhm.
or most of them. You know.
Right. Yeah.
By the way, what did you think? So this is sort of interesting because he does the. It doesn't contradict itself. All right, right. There is no contradiction in it. It's consistent,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
Um, which I thought was an interesting test. I mean, this is not. So it's almost as if he's just starting with the notion of God and then seeing whether or not this notion is itself consistent,
Yeah.
and then using Bayes' theorem
Yeah. Well, it
looked to
ties
all the
into Bayes' theorem,
arguments to prove. Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Like, I mean, well,
Yeah.
Bayes' theorem is on
Right.
197. It uses a hypothesis. So the hypothesis is going to be theism,
Hmm.
whether or not God exists or the
Hmm.
theistic God exists. And then there's the probabilities. So you've got the prior probability, how good a hypothesis is
Hmm.
considering other things we know, and then the posterior probability, explanatory power of the hypothesis. So in this, in order to meet the
Right.
explanatory power of a hypothesis, it needs to be consistent. So it's kind of like it's kind
Right.
of one of the requirements for explanation, or it increases the probability that the
Hmm.
explanation is genuine.
Right. No, that makes sense. Also,
Hmm.
too, it seems like you have to, like, in other words, you have to define your terms.
Yeah,
You can't, you
yeah,
cannot ultimately, if you're going to be proving something, you need to be able to define it in advance,
true.
or at some point along the way of proving it, right?
Yeah.
So it seems that you have to have that notion, and obviously consistency is an important criteria in rational thought anyway. So if you've got some inconsistency somewhere, that's going to be problematic.
Yeah. Hmm.
Right. So if you had a notion of theism that whatever, what if you had a particular part of that definition that clearly didn't cohere with the other parts, then we have a problem,
Yeah. Hmm.
right? Um, and seemingly we don't have that with this, right?
Right. Hmm. Um.
Okay. So the second level is, so yeah. So we've got the we've yeah. Sorry. So that the notion of theism is self-consistent. Then we can go to Bayes' theorem, and that's where we start to get all of these different arguments, right? And
Yes.
they are
Yep.
all inductive.
Yeah.
They are all inductive, um, and we've got a load of them, right?
Yeah.
Um, do you want to talk a little bit more about Bayes' theorem, or do we want to jump into the arguments that
Um.
show that God is highly there's a highly high probability that God exists?
Sure. I mean, I guess with Bayes' theorem, it Bayes' theorem works for any hypothesis, or
Right.
explaining a certain evidence or situation. And like the book gives an
Hmm.
example of a window broken and a baseball on the ground. And you could have the hypothesis
Right.
that like an alien invasion occurred, and it was just like a projectile that happened and then it broke the window and there just happened to be a baseball there. But
Right.
given
Right.
our prior probability, which is how good is our hypothesis
Hmm.
considering other things we know. So other things we know is that, oh, we like the kids play baseball every other day when the weather's nice, outside our house or whatever. And then it's like, okay, well,
Right.
given that and the fact that there's a baseball and the window break is like the size of the baseball, it's like it's a higher probability that it was
Right.
from the kids than an alien invasion.
Right.
So,
And you got the prior probability, I guess, also sort of slash background knowledge
yeah,
about kids playing baseball
exactly. Yeah, that's
in
the
the
other
area,
things
right?
we know. Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
and then the yeah, so then the posterior probability is like the explanatory power of the hypothesis. Like, is this the best
Hmm.
explanation for the um
Right.
so you put it against others, and if others are extremely unlikely, then that
Hmm.
makes your hypothesis more likely, um given that
Right.
evidence. So, but yeah, we can kind of go into some of the specifics.
Yeah.
Well,
So
one of the things here
yeah.
is like
So this yeah. Go for it.
one of the things here is that simplicity is very important, because the simpler an explanation,
Hmm.
the more likely it
Yeah.
is true. Um, there's kind of a
Oftentimes true.
caveat to that with the generality. I think, what did he call it? The like how broad,
Scope.
yeah, the scope, right? The scope of
Yeah.
the hypothesis. So
Hmm.
if you're creating a hypothesis that's like
Right.
universal, then it's its probability would be lower because it needs to apply to so many things. But if it's a simpler hypothesis, then its probability will be higher because it's less complicated in the nature of the hypothesis. So it
Sure,
kind of balances out,
sure.
and like you can come to like Einstein, or not Einstein, Newton's theory of gravity, where it's a hypothesis about
Right,
everything and it affects like dropping an apple and like planets orbiting and whatnot. And it is consistent
right.
across all those domains, but it's such a simple hypothesis, like the objects attract one another, that it works.
Right, and you don't have to be adding on all of these sort of extraneous reasons and right
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
to broaden, or to complicate it,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm. Convoluted. Yeah.
Um,
Complicated. Yeah.
yeah, exactly, exactly. So yeah, the Occam's razor. I mean, I'm not fighting the sun here. Sorry, I have this big rainbow
Yeah.
coming through, but it's okay. It's all right. We'll roll with it. We'll roll with it. Um, um, so good. So exactly. So I guess that goes for each argument, though, right? That each, so not the arguments taken as a whole, but right,
Yeah.
because that would be it
Kind
would
of.
go for each argument. It would go for each argument. This simplicity and scope.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. I think so, yeah. And it also applies as a whole. Because it's the same hypothesis, and then each of the
Hmm.
individual arguments are like supporting evidence, or supporting knowledge, like
Right.
existing knowledge that kind of tie
Hmm.
in. And
Hmm.
I think one of the things that was mentioned was by Alvin Plantinga, that if we
Uh-huh.
have many items of a hypothesis and we keep the total available evidence constant and add more items to the hypothesis, the probability gets smaller and smaller, becoming too small to support the belief.
Right.
But Swinburne replies, if we add each new bit of evidence at the same time we add each new element of hypothesis, the probability may well increase. So that's an interesting um,
Right.
like juxtaposition there. It's like if you keep if you're analyzing it incrementally, new like adding to the hypothesis and adding to the
Right.
evidence, that Swinburne believes that it increases the probability, as opposed to like saying that's all the
Right.
evidence and we're
Right.
adding
And
more.
also too, I mean, this goes back to, as an analogy, this goes back to sort of all court cases, right? I mean, you can have different pieces of evidence
Right.
uh, that will altogether point in a particular direction to a particular suspect,
Mm-hmm.
um, right? So that's this. This is totally makes sense in the court case scenario. It makes sense in this scenario as well,
Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in the end, then you're going to have a better explanation of things. So as he goes through the arguments, the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, then you can start to answer, well, sort of cause and effect issues as it
Mm-hmm.
relates to the universe. You can it responds to order and design in the universe, right? So this I don't know if I'm using this in the right way, but the scope is pretty broad, at least in terms of being able to explain more. That theism explains more than any of the alternatives.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is that fair?
Yeah.
Um, and again, we're dealing with probability in this case,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
obviously. So in other words, all these arguments together then are pushing for a higher probability that a God exists than doesn't.
Right.
Um, so, and we get a lot of arguments,
Mm-hmm.
right? We get the starting on 198, the cosmological, the teleological. Um,
Yeah. Like if God
oh, it's interesting
exists.
too. In the teleological, he actually.
Oh, if God exists, then he would likely create create a universe. Whereas without God, it's hard to explain why the universe exists. It's one of the supporting
Right,
cosmological
right,
arguments. What were you gonna say?
right. And I even think one of the other thinkers in this section also sort of talks about that even the creation of the universe would be entirely meaningless, The
Mm.
creation and death of the universe would be entirely meaningless without God.
Right.
It seems like, yeah, I mean, it seems like, I mean, as I'm thinking about it, it seems like for anything to ultimately have meaning, there has to be some type of like foundation, or something something outside of of it,
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm thinking not just in terms of the universe, but I'm thinking even in terms of, meaning in a book has got to have an outside author that is intending this book to have particular meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning and morality, it can't just be sort of like, it doesn't have any ultimate meaning if it's just sort of an agreement between you and me. Um, I mean, that sounds like a contract, which is fine. But in terms of breaking a contract, whether or not that's moral or not, it seems like you have to, once again, you have to have some type of foundation outside, some type of ground outside. And in the same way, God in the universe.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, does that apply to people,
I
like
mean, I think
personal
there's some
meaning?
forms of meaning maybe that are self-contained.
Okay, yeah.
Say it again.
Like personal meaning, like what, like personal value and meaning. Would those, do those require
Yeah.
external sources, or is it just
I
like,
don't
I don't
know.
know, do you find it in
I,
an external environment, like the thing that gives you a purpose?
yeah. I guess in terms of, if we're talking, so let's put it this way: subjective versus objective. So subjective is fine. Yeah,
Yeah.
I can have particular meaning, for me, um, and I imagine that's going to happen wherever you have brains, right, or
Mm-hmm.
minds, and maybe particular ones like me. But then there would be a question about whether or not any. I mean, like whatever. Let's take like aesthetics, right? So, or taste.
Mm-hmm.
So I can have a certain taste for thing that might be different than what you have, right? The
Mm-hmm.
cowboy hat would be a great example, right?
Sure.
So I like that. Colleen doesn't. But in terms of, but that's going to be subjective, and that's fine. We can't really debate it, because it's going to be more personal. But if you're going to go, and we'll probably have to get rid of the cowboy hat here, but if you're going to go on to objective beauty, then it does seem like there's got to be something outside that's the criterion for it,
But
or
how do you
criteria
get to
for it,
objective
right?
beauty? Like, are
Um,
you just averaging and
oh
analyzing the
gosh,
average populations of, like right? Like, I don't know. How do you analyze that without being subjective?
in terms in terms of, well, let's take the three big ones, right? In terms of the classical tradition, and not this classical tradition, but the classical tradition, like
Okay.
whatever in the West, and maybe even beyond that. But the true, the beautiful, and the good. So, um, if there, if it seems like what you're asking about in terms of beauty, and obviously beauty is going to, have the flip side of the ugly and everything in between, or the gruesome and everything in between, and we want to say objective things about that. It seems like whatever your methodology is for that, it's going to be similar to the good or the true, right? At some
I
level, unless
maybe.
unless unless the methodology is different
Okay.
to get to that objectivity. Well, I guess
Right.
it is going to be different, right?
I
Because
feel
truth in
like
mathematics, right? Truth in mathematics.
exactly. Yeah, I feel like truth is, well, I feel like you can approach truth in a deductive way, but I don't know if you can approach beauty or good. I mean, maybe you can. Um, I don't know.
Yeah.
Something's weird about that because truth
Well,
doesn't
no,
seems like
I'm
it
with
can
you.
be objective.
Beauty's, yeah, beauty's tricky. Truth in mathematics deductive, right? Truth, truth in the sciences largely inductive. I think after a while, I think some of the inductions become deductive, right? Or
Hmm.
or they're just, it's background knowledge, and then you draw
Right.
inferences from that, right?
Hmm.
Um, the good, now that becomes tricky, right? In terms of morality and virtues and vices, it seems like, if there is, put it this way, if there is, objective morality, then it can't just be it can't just be the sum of subjective, um,
Yeah.
uh, orientations to it, right?
Well,
It
I mean, can
seems
it
like you
though?
would
I
be,
mean, I don't know.
e-
Like, how do you approach it? Like, if you're analyzing how people interact with one another, you're analyzing like the
sure,
the moral implications. I feel like that. I mean, I feel like that's a valid approach. Um, I don't know.
yeah,
I guess like I don't want to discount it at least.
Well, no, I mean, maybe you're right. Maybe I'm playing up the subjective too much. In
Hmm.
other words, it's not really that it's subjective. It's more that maybe there's a term issue here. Maybe it's more that the way we come to it anyway is going to be with individual human minds. That's going to be the tool, right,
Hmm.
to work to particular moral conclusions. Now, if it's Kant, it is deductive. Okay,
Hmm.
you're familiar with the categorical imperative, right?
I think so, but remind me.
Okay, it didn't come up,
Okay.
but his whole approach to morality is based on this deductive process by which you try to look at any particular action. In each action, he says there's a maxim,
Ah, yes.
and you try to universalize the maxim,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
And if you can universalize the maxim and without inconsistency, then you've discovered the moral principle, right?
Sure.
That would be entirely deductive, right? So something like telling the truth ends up being a maxim you can universalize, whereas breaking promises, you can't universalize that with any consistency because then people can't trust each other,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
With what there's with what's being said. So in that approach, it would be deductive. Um, but you're right. I mean, like Aristotle's virtue ethics.
Hmm.
Um, that's ultimately going to be uh, there is a type of rationality to it if you accept his steps, which would be you look at the type of beings that exist. Each being has a particular telos, a aim or goal. Now, a lot of people would disagree with that point right there, but um, have a particular telos. So the telos for plants is different than non-human animals, is different from rational animals. So once you find out what the particular telos is, and basically, I'm sorry, like where it's headed and how it flourishes in getting, like how it can get there,
Hmm.
he then sort of sets up this whole idea, at least for humans, but not animals and not plants, these two poles of virtue and vices. And you always want to find, oh, sorry, two poles of vices, too much, too little,
Right.
and then trying to find the mean in every action. Now, if you follow those steps, then, but so you could argue, it seems like you could argue that with reason, right?
Yeah.
If you were going to take that approach. But it also, you are going to be looking, you're going to be giving examples of people who don't show courage.
Yeah.
So there's an element too of observation, you know. Um, so so what we just did was reaching some type of the good, right?
Hmm.
With or at least we sketched out ways of reaching the good with reason, right?
Yeah, that's fair.
But when it comes to beauty, I think that is going to be tricky.
Yeah.
um, and I'm probably not the best one to address this, but just because I know that there are certain things like symmetry, proportionality,
Yeah.
balance. You know what I'm saying? And a lot of people will disagree with that. That are more sort of like modern art to the present, right? Where they try to flip that on its head.
Hmm.
But in a classical sense, uh, there would be certain things one could point to and say that has symmetry. Ergo, we have found something beautiful. But the debate will be about how did you even come to these particular um, aspects,
Right. Hmm.
right? Um, so this all goes back to the question of whether or not something. Do you have something? Do you have to have something outside of the thing in order for it to be meaningful?
Right.
Um, and I don't know. I feel like if it has um, objective meaning, there is something going on outside of just the individual's perception of it.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, maybe. It's, I don't know. I guess like it's one of the things where it's like if you assume there's
But
objective
uh,
meaning,
yeah,
then you can always find the subjective
yeah.
meaning in an individual. But what if you assume there's no objective meaning? Um, can you still find subjective meaning in individuals?
Hmm, hmm.
So I don't know.
Well, if there is no objective meaning, then whatever meaning exists would be subjective, would be individualistic,
Right.
right?
But is there a problem with that?
Or hold on, or or with or within a community, right?
Hmm.
Right?
Yeah, but so is there like a
Like,
problem with that? Is that inconsistent with something else?
I think so. Subjective meaning ends up getting um, it, okay. So all right, no, there's not a problem with it.
Okay.
But if there is, but if there is a, so yeah, there's not a problem with it. But if there is objective, um, let's put it this way: I feel like there's a certain value placed on objective versus subjective, right? There's a
Hmm.
that one ought to want objective truth more than um, sort of just subjective meaning. Um, I'm not saying this is true for everyone, but that's just sort of a sense that I have,
Hmm.
right? Um, because subjective meaning has a lot of has a huge role to play in terms of like I don't like you think about like poetry. This is the poet's subjective encounter of X. This is
Hmm.
the painter's subjective encounter of Y. So um,
But it's also like the thing that gets
so
anybody out of
yes.
bed every day, right? It's like what keeps you going. It's the meaning like of your life, you know? It's like it doesn't it's
Yeah,
a very
yeah.
personal like thing. It doesn't have to be
No, that's true.
object like I don't know. It depends on what level of meaning we're
Yeah,
talking about
I
too.
guess yeah, that's very true. And I'm also thinking about like as we're talking about religion, the attraction toward objective truth is something that ultimately gives you ultimate meaning. So my
Hmm.
subjective, my subjective meaning is fine. It's temporary, as
Hmm.
I am temporary. It's finite. It has some of those features. They're not bad things. I'm trying to think of like whatever. I went to see a soccer game last night with my gardener, something I've never done before, but it was a two Mexican teams. My gardener's Mexican. We talked soccer. So there's a meaning placed on that event. Like I was like, this is cool. I've never actually hung out with a gardener. I've never, how many people have done that? That's sort of
Hmm.
cool. I don't know him that well, but and then also I guess the meaning that I place on it for him, that I was able to give him a ticket. He's Mexican. It's one of his favorite teams. Those are all good. Those are, um, and I guess I might be mixing up meaning and value here, but I think they can get combined, and that's okay.
Sure.
But in terms of like objective meaning, um, that ends up almost like Aristotle, right? But even for religions, that ends up giving you like enabling you to entirely structure, let's say, all the subjective meanings and everything that we do and getting out of bed in the morning to this higher good that, let's say, in the context of religion, is eternal.
Hmm.
So there's so that's where I see the valuation.
It's an abstraction.
Subjective. It's not that well, it's that's where I would give the value. I would give a higher value to objective meaning than subjective meaning. If there is a God that exists, and this God has given me meaning and ultimate meaning and purpose, then then there's a hierarchy from that down to my subjective meaning. In other words, the
Hmm.
soccer game is you know was meaningful, but not nearly as meaningful as me being made in the image of God, intended to have a relationship with the Creator and to enjoy eternal bliss with Him.
Hmm.
You with me?
Yeah, I mean,
Now, postmodernists wouldn't agree with that, and atheists wouldn't agree with that.
right, which is
Um,
so that I guess what's weird about that is that that form of objective meaning requires that worldview, like as a prerequisite. So,
oh, totally,
so you can't
totally,
like how do
yeah.
you like I'm trying to think how do you approach objective meaning without having the worldview influence your reasoning?
So, probably your best example would be something. It would be something very selective like math. Math
Sure.
is meaningful. Can we use that there? Well, we were.
Maybe.
I don't know. I slipped into true. Well, let me play it out, and then we'll see whether or not it's right. But it's meaningful based on the inner working deduction that dominates math. The I want to say that. See, now I'm saying, I'm really saying it's objectively true. Is
Yeah.
what I'm saying.
No, that's what like that's
You
what I
know.
feel like I get to. If you don't have a worldview in place to structure these arguments, I feel like you can get to objective truth,
Yeah.
but getting to beauty or meaning is really difficult. Or I don't know. Or I don't know.
Yeah.
It does
Yeah.
it's not as deterministic, I guess.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know. I think you're absolutely right. Um, it sort of reminds me of Jean-Paul Sartre's um, notion of God, his reaction, or yeah, his notion of God. He was an atheist, existentialist, and he said it's sort of like when you have someone creating something, they are imbuing it with meaning.
Mm-hmm.
So whoever made scissors gave it a type of meaning.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So
There's an intention.
okay. So in a similar way, yes,
Mm-hmm.
yes. In a similar way, God creates. Whenever God creates, there is a particular intention that gives it meaning,
Okay,
right?
sure.
And that meaning is super high for humans because we're made imago Dei in the image of God. Um, and then what he did was he said, if you take, and this is what he does as an existentialist, you take the creator out, then you just have someone that exists with no objective meaning. You are the maker of your meaning,
Mm-hmm.
and you really could do anything, in a sense, because there is no objective meaning or purpose because you took the creator out. You took the scissors maker out to give that thing meaning.
I mean,
You just
maybe.
are. You're thrown into the world.
Like I
Yeah.
feel like no, I feel like it makes sense. If you
Well,
have a creator
where
and
does
something
me?
that's created, then
Yeah.
there's an intention for the created thing. And so they're instilling meaning
Yeah.
in that creation. So if you do take
Right.
um, God out of the equation, then you have to answer the question of why the universe
Hmm.
is here in the first place, right? So that becomes a problem. But if you
Right.
can if you
Right.
can if you can
Right.
start from that point, let's say that you can, then you have like okay, within the universe, like I feel like it's almost like God created the universe. The universe as a whole has a meaning because of that, right? But
Right.
if you can remove that and still have consistency, right? Then you can look at things within the universe. We are people that create. There are things in the universe
Right.
that have intention and create things with intention. So those things can still have meaning. But then there's also like this other side of things where it's
Totally.
like you find meaning in things that weren't the way they were intended. Like somebody can
Hmm.
create
Hmm.
something with an intent and like a purpose. Like oh, there are railings to go upstairs so you can hold on to it or
Yeah.
for old people to help them, but then like a skateboarder
Sure.
would be like oh that's a really cool thing to grind on, so it's like they find
Yeah.
a different
Totally. Totally.
purpose, a
Totally.
different intention, a different meaning from
Yeah.
the created structure
Yeah.
of something else. So like I feel like you can still kind of have
Yeah.
you can still have meaning within the universe without the universe having a meaning as a whole, but you do have to solve that gap.
Sure.
And I don't know the way that would happen.
Sure. But that's fair. That's fair. So, in other words, the meaning or purpose of things can be various
Yeah.
of things,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
But it raises a question about the meaning of human life, right?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I
I
feel
think
like.
with what Sartre's getting at is so what Sartre's getting at is what you're getting at with the railing,
Mm-hmm.
right? Only the difference would be that the railing had an initial intention. So let's
Right.
just
Mm-hmm.
save that or set that aside. But it's more play. Meaning, in other words, I have more freedom to create the kind of self that I want to create because because I am the only thing that's going to give my life purpose. So if I want to be a couch potato, then that's the meaning I give to my life through my actions. If I want to be a philanthropist, then that's the meaning I give to my life through my actions, right?
Right.
So that there's that, but I would still say that even with that subjective meaning, it's finite, it's limited, it dies with you. I mean, maybe what you created, or a legacy
Right.
lives on beyond you,
Or
but it is
communal
qualitatively
meaning.
different than sure, sure. It's qualitatively different than an objective meaning and purpose given to you by a creator. Because it's it within that theistic Christian worldview, it's eternal.
Right.
You know.
I don't know. I'm sorry. Random thoughts are popping into my head. It's like, okay, great. Some people's objective
Yeah,
meaning and
it's
purpose
fine.
was to die and rot in hell forever. Great. I don't know. Like, I don't like that.
Right.
um,
Right. No, I know. Well, that's another book, right?
yeah, that's true. Anyways.
The hell book.
Yeah.
That yeah. So we've gone beautifully far afield, which is fine.
Yeah. No, it's good.
Especially when it leads to an interesting discussion.
But we can tie this back into Swinburne, where
Yeah.
I mean, well, he talks about morality, but he has this mind-body dualism that he uses to explain the free will given to humans, which was one of the requirements for the theistic God,
Okay.
right? Because God's intention was to create a universe, and the universe would serve his purpose if people had free will, essentially.
Right.
So I don't know. There's like, yeah, that mind-body dualism is kind of coming into this meaning aspect too, because it's like the objective meaning is assigned to the mind, and the body is more bound by the physics of the universe.
Law.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. You. Oh my.
Oh,
There we go. I lost my connection. Are you there? Can
I'm
you hear
here.
me?
Yeah, you've been here the whole time, so I don't know. Like, I think you stuttered a little bit, but yeah.
Okay. Well, I was saying you lost your network connection trying to reconnect, so we'll just continue to talk. Let me ask you this, because and I need to be sensitive to your time, and we might just need to hold off to the other two thinkers for the next time. Why not? What's and we had talked about this before. One of the let's just sort of sketch it out. You've got Swinburne using Bayes' theorem. He's using all of these particular arguments. All of these arguments at some level are at let's say a high level of probability are pointing to a God, right?
Right.
Cosmological argument, teleological argument, argument from morality, all of these different things.
History and miracles.
But the one thing, yes, exactly. The one thing that we discussed before was one of the criticisms of using Bayes' theorem, and
oh, now we really did disconnect. Hello? Hello?
yes, hello.
Okay.
They bounced me out for
I was
a
gonna say,
second.
now we really did disconnect.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I had the little spinny thing going on for a while, even though you could hear and have visual.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that criticism in closing.
Yeah. So I mean, the primary criticism of Swinburne's arguments are that he's using Bayes' theorem, which works, but it's works in a numerical sense, right? So Bayes' theorem is used in mathematics, it's used in algorithms, AI, like all sorts of things when you have actual numbers that you can assign to things. So the criticism is, how can you assign probabilities to these events that aren't actually numerical? Yeah.
So just to be clear, cosmological argument is not numerical. It's
exactly. So
it's a proposition.
So you could assign
it's statements.
Yeah. So you could assign like you could estimate like initial values. So if something's truly random, you could have the probability be 50% chance.
Hmm.
You could, if something's more likely, you could bring that up to like a 60 or 70 or 80% chance. If something's less
Right.
likely, you could bring it down a little bit. But your your end result of your Bayes theorem is going to be as accurate as your initial values. So it's like,
Now, can I ask you a question?
yeah,
Maybe give me or give me an example where I'm thinking about the initial values.
yeah,
So, are you always? Is it the case that an applying Bayes theorem, let's say within the sciences or in other areas, uh, who or what is determining the initial values?
sure. So
In other words, what I'm saying is, does the particular practice or environment or discipline determine the values, or am I determining the values in every situation?
it
Bef-
depends. It depends on what you're applying it to, right? So,
okay,
say you're applying it to a medical situation where you have uh, you're trying to determine whether or not somebody has COVID, and there are two COVID tests, right?
okay,
And one returns positive, one returns negative, but they're two different tests from two different manufacturers. They're not using the exact same process, right? So to determine whether or not you have COVID, you have to use those two values, right? So one is going to be, a positive value, one's going to be a negative value, which is going to be like a
hmm,
0 and a 1, right? But
right,
you're going to multiply those by statistics, okay? So the
right,
statistics would be how well did each test do in a population of people, and those
right,
statistics are going to be probability based. So it's like it and what's interesting about Bayes' theorem is the more you apply the tests in different scenarios, the more accurate it gets.
right,
So because you can put it through kind of an update loop where you get a probability and then that becomes your prior probability, and then you add new
right.
information and then you
This
get a
is this
probability.
is like the example with the throwing the balls on the table with the scientist back to the table, right?
Exactly, right. So
And
yeah,
each new ball is adding.
yeah. So in this case, like if you have two COVID tests, then it each one is a different ball on the table, and you have two of
Right.
those. But in order to get the accuracy of an individual test result, like um, you're looking at the population, so you're like, okay, how many of those were tested? How many tested positive versus how many tested negative? And then you're looking at
Right.
the false positives and false negatives too.
So, but it seems like there the initial values are built in.
Yeah, by statistics.
Right, 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 right. And
Mhm.
so the real question would be then to go back to the application to theism and is well, one, if all the arguments are ultimately spoken and word based
Mhm.
and there's nothing numerical in them, then one is how do we, how do we quantify it,
Yeah, exactly.
right? Um, and then and then when you talk about determining initial value, see that seemed to me sort of like with the COVID example, it's built in with the two tests, the population and statistics.
Right. Hmm.
So I'm not just coming up with initial values.
Right.
Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair.
Okay.
Because
Whereas, yeah,
you collect the data, and then you use statistics to analyze it together. So
mhm,
if you can collect the data for these arguments and then you can use statistics to analyze it together, then that could work. But you just need to have something that you can count,
sure,
right?
yeah. So how
So
would that work with the cosmological argument? Or
that's a good
do you
question.
know like it's it's like how do you even do? I mean, let's just do a really simple one. I don't know, whatever. Where there's design, there's a designer. So we can do the teleological argument, right?
Hmm.
Like I don't even know how to start to
Um,
make it. And real quickly, is that what is being quantified, or is the sum total of the arguments being quantified?
Both,
Okay,
because the sum total of the arguments is applying Bayes' theorem in succession.
right, right. Each
Um,
argument is another ball on the table,
exactly. Okay,
as it
so
were.
all right, I'm just looking at the equation that they have in the book in 197. So probability is P, hypothesis is H, same as a theory. Evidence is E, and background knowledge is K, relate to each other. So here's the table. The probability of the explanatory hypothesis, right? So this is the probability of your hypothesis, theism is true, given that you're given the evidence and the background knowledge, right? Equals the posterior probability, which is explanatory power of the hypothesis. So that's the probability of evidence given the hypothesis and background knowledge, divided by the probability of just the evidence and the background knowledge, right, without the hypothesis, times the prior probability, how good a hypothesis is considering other things we know. So just the hypothesis given existing knowledge. So if you have existing knowledge that the universe had a starting point, right, that could be I guess a quantifiable existing knowledge, right?
Sure, a Big Bang theory might help with that.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then you've got explain. I'm trying to figure out how exactly this works. Like, I don't know if that would be background knowledge or evidence is the thing. It's hard to figure
Which?
out.
Big
Like the Big
Bang
Bang
theory, I
theory.
think.
Yeah.
Well, wouldn't that be background knowledge?
Yeah, I guess it
Because
would.
the hypothesis is saying that the hypothesis is ultimately saying that there was a first cause, and
Yeah.
that first cause is God.
Mhm.
So then we do background knowledge. Was there or a beginning?
Right.
Okay, there was a beginning to the universe, and God was the one that caused it. So then your background knowledge seemingly would, Big Bang cosmology would be a type of background knowledge.
Right. So then you'd be asking the question, hypothesis, theism. What is the probability of theism given background knowledge? What is the probability of theism given Big Bang theory as background knowledge, right?
Right.
Or the universe has a beginning as background knowledge. So then that needs to be quantifiable, right? And those aren't numerical terms, so it's like how do you assign a probability to that unit?
Yeah.
Theism given
Yep.
Big Bang, right?
There you go. Boom.
So that's what you need to assign value to.
Yeah. And that's your homework. I have no idea how to go about that.
Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of the main criticism.
Yeah.
Like you can assign you could assign a verbal value to it, an estimate, but it's like I don't know. Maybe you could run some sort of statistical analysis where you put in different numbers and see what comes out.
Sure. Another thing too, we're not reading Swinburne. We're reading a summary of his view.
Yeah.
He's written a lot of books, and he might actually
comment on that.
Show.
Criticism.
Yeah. Well, he might illustrate how it's done.
True.
In some way, and that's a possibility. We should probably stop there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right.
Yep. All right. Stop.